Hello, welcome back to the basement. On this episode, I'm going to take some Scrapwood offcuts that I bought in bulk from an architectural mill and see if I can't turn it into a pedal board. What I've got here specifically is sapele and cherry. And like I said, this is offcuts from an architectural mill. They mill up basically hardwood trim and like timber frame type trusses and things like that. And every once in a while they have offcuts that they'll pallet up and see if any knucklehead on Facebook Marketplace wants to buy them. In this case, I am that knucklehead. So none of this stuff is uniform. A lot of the stuff, as you can see, like this piece is severely twisted. And I bought a ton of this, like literally a ton. So I'm going to try and see what I can do to turn some of this into something usable. Anyway, let's get off to it.
All right, so we're going to try something different for this particular video. I'm going to try doing some voiceover to kind of help speed things along rather than trying to explain things on camera as much. So here what I've been doing is kind of getting together the rough measurements of all the individual pieces. And because I'm doing this out of Scrapwood, I'm having to piece pieces together to make the dimensions that I need for the finished pieces, the individual parts, I should say. So I'm about to do a couple of glue ups. These are for the side and center sections. I've also got to glue a piece or two pieces together to make the front lip or stretcher. And then I've also got one of the top stretchers, slats, if you will, I've got material that's too thin, but I want to figure out a way to use it, so I'm laminating two pieces together that would otherwise be scrap. And this is generally the problem with trying to do Scrapwood projects, is you find yourself not getting the dimensions out of the materials you need, and you're having to take a ton of extra steps to get the dimensions that you need. And that's definitely the case for this project. So after I get those things into clamps, I'm taking the other pieces that I do have and I'm trying to get a couple square edges on them, because most of these are rough cuts. They do have one or two straight and square surfaces because they are offcuts. But I'm not trusting that. So basically I took all the remaining pieces not in clamps, went ahead and face jointed and also, squared up a perpendicular edge as best I could to get a good gluing surface. So there's the three first parts that I have that I've glued up. That should give me most of the stock for the individual parts that I need to make for this pedal board. As you'll see later, I still have a few more parts to figure out. So now I got those out of the clamps. I'm going to go ahead and joint them up and then run them through the table saw and then ultimately the thickness planer. Tell you what, these little flip-top tables would not allow me to, if I didn't have those, I would not be able to keep the tools that I have in this little 9-foot by 10-foot shop that I've made for myself. They've been absolutely essential. So here I'm realizing that I'm not going to be able to make the dimensions that I want. And consequently, I'm going to take this really, really twisted, warped piece of sapele and try and graft it on. I'm not far off, but two of my slats are just not as wide as I want. And rather than make the other two the same narrow dimension, I decided I'm going to take the narrow ones and widen them out.
Alright, so the idea here is I use this piece of sapwood red oak as a clamping caul. I use this other piece of twisted sapele as a clamping caul. Glue this seam, glue this seam, smoosh it all together in the clamps.
Alright, so after that explanation of what's going on, I'm going to actually start laminating these together. Now I'm not worried about getting these flush on one side because I'm going to kind of true these up later. So I want a little bit of overhang on both sides of the slat. So don't worry about the fact that I'm not getting everything coplanar on one side. It's not the point. So now moving on to working on at least getting the rough dimensions lined up on the side pieces as well as the center section.
All right, so I need to cut the taper in the sides and center piece. I don't know if you can see the line drawn here, but I want to be able to cut that straight. So I've just made the world's dumbest and smallest tapering jig using the only tiny piece of scrap MDF I had left. This is just so I don't have to run to the store and get some more. Probably only going to use this the one time. But this is how it works. Got a bolt going through, super glued in place. Got 2 pieces of wood because my little scrap piece of MDF isn't long enough. I've got some self-stick sandpaper here to hold the piece in place. And then I made these little knobs with some nuts recessed into them and some washers. And that basically holds the piece of wood in place. So this is the dumbest tapering jig for the cheapest table saw. So anyway, let me set this up and get to ripping some tapers.
So this tapering jig is an exercise in, I don't want to say futility, but in patient ingenuity, let's say. Because I could have made a proper tapering jig, but I didn't have a big enough piece of MDF to do it with. So that's why I had to come up with this ridiculous clamping mechanism, because the wood was just too small to make a tapering jig out of. But I wanted to get these ripped that night, and tomorrow was just too late for my mindset at the time, so I muscled through and made this ridiculously cumbersome to set up tapering jig, but it did work, and for some reason I haven't burnt it yet. Haven't used it since, but it's there.
I had a little bit of misalignment on one of them, but I plan on hand planing these to get them perfect anyway, so for like zero cost, this stupid little thing works. Yeah. Cool. All right, let's see how this experiment went. If this doesn't work, I've got plenty of sapele. I can do the whole pedal board out of sapele, but I was just trying to get 2 different, contrasting hardwoods that wasn't completely super heavy. I chose so far really light pieces of sapele, except for these accent pieces. So yeah, this thing is still pretty warped. This is stuck on there so far. Hopefully when I trim this out, it'll work. A little bit of glue on the caul. I'm happy with that.
All right, so here's that excess I was talking about. I'm getting the big chunks off of it with the bandsaw, and then I'm going to finish it and get it perfectly flush with the rest of the slat with the hand plane. And then I'm going to get all 3 of the 2 side pieces and the center piece. I'm going to get those squared away as well. And yes, I couldn't help myself. I had to buy an oscillating belt sander Found that one on Marketplace for stupid cheap, so I did buy it. Most of my tools came off of Marketplace.
So this is the essential design. I gotta find a front piece. So with these accented pieces, I've got a couple of different things that I can do. As far as patterns go, I gotta decide which one I wanna do. All right, I'm gonna find a toe kick here.
So basically here I'm using the front piece of the pedal board as the thickness guide for the toe kick part. So all I'm doing is I'm just setting that between the fence and the blade to set my thickness precisely as I can. Okay, while I figure out what joiner I want to use to put this frame together, I'm kind of going back and forth between my original plan, which was sliding dovetails. The only reason why I don't like the sliding dovetail is just because of the exposure of the end grain on the side, which I'd like to minimize. But then again, I'm gonna be lapping the slats into the side, so I'm gonna have end grain there. So I just gotta figure out, you know, if that is what I wanna do or not. The alternative would be a splined miter. So it'll be straight up regular 45-degree miter, but I would do splines in it. And I've got a router jig that came as part of the router table that I bought. It was a Facebook Marketplace find that's I've never used, so this would be a good excuse to use that. So I'm considering that as an option as well. But in the meantime, I've got slats like this and like this that I need to stabilize. So it's off to some epoxy work. Yay! Nothing quite slows a project down like having to do epoxy work. I am not a fan of epoxy, although I use it quite a bit because I generally work in scrapwood and reclaimed wood, so there's always something to stabilize, and for some reason I am a glutton for punishment, and I like to use tabletop epoxy just because it's cheap and convenient, but it is not the most forgiving. A lot of times for crack filling, you need something a lot more viscous to really do the job best. But here I'm just trying to stabilize this with some really, really old tabletop epoxy. And it slows the project down because you generally got to wait for it to cure for about 8 hours to 12 hours. Sometimes even more than that. Generally 24 hours is best before you start trying to get off the excess. And because this is a gravity-fed solution, if you've got gaps on another side, then guess what you got to do? You got to let one side dry and cure, flip it over, and then fill the other, which is what I'm doing here. At the end of the day, the result's pretty cool looking, though. So while that's curing, I'm going to take the toe kick, I'm going to take the side edges, and I'm going to take the front edge of the frame of the pedal board, and I'm going to try and use this janky handmade miter jig that I made a while back that has since blown out all the saw curves on. I'm going to try and make some accurate miters with it.
So I do need to rip this front face down, but all in all, I think I'll be able to get this to work. So these corners will be splined with some contrasting color wood. And then I'll have the center one slot in with some sliding dovetails. I also need to skeletonize this so I can have cable pass through. So otherwise I would just drill a couple of big holes. I think I'm gonna scrap that and just drill 3 holes with a Forstner bit. That would look cooler from the underneath, but nobody's gonna see it. And I'm afraid it's gonna be too weak because these are gonna be inset right there, so I'm only gonna have a 1/4 inch of wood on either side of that. So if I take that much out, I think it's just gonna weaken it too much, and the circle's a really strong shape, so. But I think 4 holes like that could kind of look cool too though. Especially if they are descending sizes, which I think I can pull off with my Forstner bits. So I'm gonna stew on that for a minute and figure out where center is to do these sliding dovetails and kind of work that out.
All right, so now that most of that epoxy is cured, the thinner bits I'm just trying to take off with a card scraper. My favorite method of removing excess in this type of capacity is a paint scraper and a heat gun. And again, I'm not trying to go deep. You generally need something that is wide enough to ride on 2 sides of a void that you filled. And oh boy, this is where my miters get jacked up. I'm trying to use the edge guide on the oscillating sander, and you know, banking on the sander. This is one of the first times I've used this tool. I just got it. Just like most of my tools, they're Facebook Marketplace finds, and this one was no exception. And just trying to make perfect the enemy of good with those miters, I sanded too much off of one piece and not another, so the lengths weren't perfect and they weren't in square anymore, and they were slightly off pitch. So I took what were, you know, good enough miters and made them not good enough. So here I'm thinking that the bottoms of each piece is not square to the face, so I'm tweaking that and seeing if that tightens up the miters, and I just make stuff so much worse. Oh, it's hilarious watching me struggle editing this footage, seeing what all went wrong. At this point, I decide to banded perfection on the miters and turn my attention toward an even bigger butcher job, and that is trying to my first ever sliding dovetail. So what I'm doing here is I'm using just a 1/4 inch straight cut bit to do the bulk of the work, and then I'm coming back with a 3/8 inch dovetail bit. Getting the center piece a little bit shorter to match. You know, my test piece, I got it all calibrated right, but my janky router lift doesn't like to stay put. So that's why you see the block of wood next to the adjuster, and it still moved a little bit. Or I just didn't have it set up right.
Okay, so essentially the problem is this is too long. So shoulder to shoulder, it needs to be the same as the inside corners. Something tells me I need to get these miters freaking figured out first, and they're not good enough. They're just not. So I'm gonna figure out the miters first, mainly because that may make this even shorter, and I'd rather not have to do this twice if I don't have to. So I'm going to try to set up my table saw to do an accurate miter. It's the only thing I haven't tried at this point. So I'm gonna try that, and we'll see if I can get it done.
So I gotta say, I did practice off camera a little bit, and I was actually really surprised how close I got it.
So anyway, that's as close as I'm going to get it. Now what I need to do is I need to figure out shoulder to shoulder. It's probably going to still be about half a centimeter on each side. It should be about right. So I'm going to trim half a centimeter off of each side. So I'm going to switch the saw back to my regular crosscut sled because it's squarer.
Clearly I'm trying to be ultra precise on this cut. Now if I had more stock milled up the same size, I would have just cut a new piece entirely, but I didn't.
Not exactly what I figured, but I think I can wedge that in place with some cool contrasting wood color inlays or something. I'll figure it out. I'm not terribly worried about this. But this is slightly taller in the middle, so before I start rabbiting in for the slats, I need to even these out.
So now I'm just getting some rough cut poplar. That's going to be my gap filler on these horrible, horrible dovetails. Now I could have gone with a, comparable piece of wood and try to hide it, but I figured this was a mistake that was just due to being a rookie one, and I was like, you know what, instead of just trying to disguise it and mask it, let's feature it, let's make it, I don't know, just something that doesn't look like it was meant to be blended in, and see what that aesthetic yields. So I'm just using some CA glue, and because I'm using CA glue, then my trimming method has to be a little bit altered. Rather than using a hand plane and putting a ton of force on it, I end up using a belt sander to try and flush everything up and then re-mill it, that I've got the dovetail kind of figured out on the router. So here I am on the belt sander. And again, I could have used a hand plane. I just didn't want to risk breaking the bond of the CA glue. So I figured this was, figured this was an option. It certainly was an option. The best one? I don't know. So now I got the sliding dovetail mostly figured out and dialed in. Now I'm going to turn my attention to ripping all the slats down into a uniform width. And I'm trying to keep as much of the accented sapele stripe, so I'm cutting off the lighter shade side part of the slat. All right, so now that I've got everything figured out slats-wise, I'm going to take the two sides and the center section. I'm going to use some two-sided tape to stick them together so that when I cut the rabbets, I'm doing all three exactly the same. And I'm using some patch cables, the widest patch cables that I've got, as like to set the space between the slats. So once I figure that out, then it's just a bunch of math, and I'm using some calipers to try and, make sure I get the spread even and that sort of thing. So lots of tinkering with the layout before I'm finally happy with it. And then it's just setting the blade, the depth of the slat, and making a ton of curve cuts. This is what happens when you don't have a table saw that you can run a dado set on, but you really don't need all that. You just need a little bit more patience. Yes, I could use my router table for this very same process, but the crosscut sled makes really quick, short work of this. So now I got all my curves cut. I'm going to use a chisel just to break out all the slices and then just clean it up with chisels and files. I don't know why, but this part of doing rabbets or any kind of thing, any kind of joinery where I do this method, I always find this part so satisfying. I don't know why I like it so much, but I do. So as I'm using this chisel to clear out the excess material, I'm trying to make sure that I'm cutting inward and not outward. So I attack it from both sides so that I don't have any kind of blowout going all the way through the workpiece. So that's why I'm switching directions and going in and out. So now I got all of the rabbets set. Instead of tweaking the rabbets to fit the slats, I'm hand planing the slats to fit each rabbet. I've not gone that way before, but I'm happy with the results.
We're really, really close, and these half laps, or in this case full laps, these are some of the tightest ones I've ever done, and the reason being is I worked on, instead of the gaps that I cut, I worked on the piece that's going in them. And that's the first time I've done that, so I'll have to remember that next time. It's looking good. Alright, before I can really work on putting this thing together, namely gluing up the corners, I need to do whatever cutting out of shapes that I can before assembly. So one of the things I want to do on the left-hand side, the player's left, I want to install this piece here, which is power. It's got a fuse to protect the power, and then a rocker switch that'll go in it.
So a past version of me probably wouldn't have considered order of operations quite so much here. So I'm actually proud of past Brian and actually thinking about making the steps be easiest as possible. Normally I would have gone straight to the glue up because I'm impatient that way. Or any step that is going to be easier to do while it's apart, I decide to do while it's apart. And that's not something I normally have patience for. So this is really one of those tune-up projects before I start making my first base by hand. And yeah, even though I'm not using a ton of the same skill set, I am using a lot. And one of the things that's most critical when taking on a challenge as big as building an instrument is order of operations. So now I decide to put my logo on the front face of the pedal board, so I'm laying that out very, very meticulously. And this is like in preparation or tune up for doing a headstock inlay at some point. So I don't know why I'm putting masking tape over this and then cutting it out like a stencil. I felt like it was a appropriate idea at the time. I think I was trying to minimize tear out because I decided for some strange reason I wanted to try and hand carve this, in part because this particular piece of sapele is like a really lightweight piece of sapwood sapele, and it's very, very soft. So I figured if I'm going to have any kind of reps on hand carving any kind of inlay work like this soft piece of wood is going to be forgiving enough to do that. So I think I put the masking tape down just to try and help minimize chip out. That's probably my thought process. So I am using a drill here just to get the perfectly round parts. So the the end portion of the curve of the bass clef, and then the little colon part on the inside of the bass clef. So anything that needs a perfectly round dot, why carve that by hand when you can use a drill bit? So I'm mixing up some custom blue epoxy using a couple different flavors of blue mica powder and making my inlay. And I'm not happy with this inlay. Almost a year later, I'm probably thinking about redoing it, but this because I didn't make the carve deep enough. And when I sanded it down, final sanding, I didn't necessarily go through the inlay, but anyway, I'd like it to be deeper. So I'm using the sander here specifically for the fact that I don't want to blow through the inlay that I just put in. So I'm afraid if I use the heat gun and the paint scraper, it has a tendency to lift things out. And because my carve is so shallow, I felt it was the best idea was just to sand it. All right, so that's going to wrap up this first of 2 episodes on this bass pedal board. Now that I've got all the individual pieces ready to go, it's just about ready for final assembly and finish work. Now let me know in the comments what you think about this particular format where I do some on-camera narration but mostly off-camera narration, explaining my rationale and my process. It's not because I think I'm doing something great, it's just I feel like I get as much from comments that are telling me what I'm doing wrong as the pats on the back ones. So if you see something that I'm doing terribly wrong or think I could be doing something better and you've got more experience, definitely let me know. That's what it's all about. But anyway, I definitely appreciate you. If you feel like I've earned it, please subscribe. That would be fantastic. And we'll see you in part 2, which is going to come out very, very quickly. That said, thanks for joining me down here in the basement.